All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving deep into what makes the Dutch, well, Dutch.
No.
And we're not messing around with just windmills and tulips and cheese here.
Right.
We're going deeper than that.
Absolutely.
We're going past those tourist brochures to figure out what's really going on with this culture.
Okay.
And to help us do that, we're looking at it through the eyes of people who actually picked up and moved to the Netherlands.
Yeah. It's like you can read a travel guide or you can get lost in the back alleys of, Amsterdam.
Right.
And those little surprises, those little things that you discover, kind of the challenges that you face as a newcomer, I think those are the real cultural gems.
Yeah, and you start to understand what makes people tick.
Exactly.
When you encounter those things. So to help us on this journey, we are tapping into the wisdom of Saskia Maarse, who is a Dutch intercultural expert.
Yeah.
She interviewed people from 30 different countries.
Wow.
Who now live in the Netherlands, and asked them, what's it like living with the Dutch? And let me tell you, they did not hold back.
I bet. And, it's so interesting how these cultural perceptions, they're so relative, right?
Yeah.
What might seem totally normal to you and me, because we're kind of in the same cultural sphere.
Same boat, yeah.
Could be completely baffling to someone else.
Absolutely. And one thing that jumped out from these interviews is this whole idea of a good Gergold society.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase before.
I have. And it's one of those that I find really hard to translate because well-organized just doesn't quite cut it.
Doesn't really.
It's deeper than that.
Yeah.
It's like this deep-seated belief that things should run smoothly, that things should be efficient.
Mm.
You think about it, the Dutch, they literally built their country by wresting land from water.
That's true.
Geographically speaking.
Yeah, I never thought about it like that.
Talk about organization.
But it makes so much sense.
Right.
You don't just conquer the North Sea without some serious organizational skills.
Absolutely. And I think that history, that battle against the elements,
yeah,
it's woven into the fabric of Dutch culture.
Okay.
It's in their punctual public transport. It's in their meticulously planned cities. It's even in the way they line up their groceries on the checkout counter.
Okay, I have to admit, I have seen pictures of Dutch grocery bags all lined up.
Perfectly.
And it's a little intimidating, not gonna lie.
Yeah.
But it does make you wonder, what happens when things don't go according to plan in this good Gergeld utopia?
Yeah, well, that's where things get interesting.
Okay.
And let's just say the Dutch are not exactly shy about voicing their opinions when something disrupts that expected order.
They're not afraid to speak up.
They're not afraid to speak up.
I like it.
Yeah.
It's like they have their plan and don't mess with the plan.
Yeah, don't mess with the plan.
And if you do mess with the plan, they're going to let you know.
They will let you know. Politely?
Yeah, politely, but directly.
Directly, yes.
So, I can see how that would lead to some interesting encounters.
Absolutely, particularly for people coming from cultures where you might sort of tiptoe around issues a little bit more.
Yeah, or kind of coat things in layers of politeness. The Dutch, like we were saying, just come right out and say it.
So let's talk about that directness.
Okay.
What did the people that Saskia talked to, what did they have to say about that?
Yeah, so she actually makes this really interesting distinction between two types of directness, and it's something that I've definitely noticed living in the Netherlands.
Oh.
There's this direct communication of information, and then there's direct feedback. And I think you find both of those really woven into the fabric of Dutch culture.
Okay, what's the difference?
So direct communication is pretty much what it sounds like, right? You need to tell somebody something, you just come right out and say it.
Yeah.
You don't beat around the bush. There's no need to kind of read between the lines or...
Right.
Yeah, it's very much this is the information.
Which I can appreciate, I get that.
Right.
But I can see how that would be a little jarring if you weren't used to that, if you're from a culture that's a little bit more...
Absolutely.
Dances around things a little.
And it's not meant to be rude or anything. It's just seen as efficient, right?
Yeah.
Why waste time with a bunch of fluff when you can just get straight to the point?
Right.
Just deliver the information clearly.
So that's the information part. Then you said there's direct feedback.
Direct feedback.
Okay.
And I think this is where it gets even more sort of culturally nuanced because there are all these expectations around, saving face and politeness and things like that. So in many cultures, you might soften negative feedback. You might kind of sandwich it between a couple of compliments, or you might even just kind of hint at it indirectly and hope that the other person picks up what you're putting down.
And the Dutch don't do that.
Not so much.
They're just like, this needs to be fixed.
Pretty much. I mean, again, it's that kind of, they see it as more honest, more transparent,
Yeah.
and ultimately more helpful to just address the issue head on.
To just get it out there.
Rip off the Band-Aid.
No sugarcoating.
No sugarcoating,
The
exactly.
kids are getting.
Exactly. So I can, again, see how that would be a bit of a shock to the system if you're not quite prepared for it.
Yeah, you definitely might get some direct feedback you weren't expecting.
You might.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the direct communication, the direct feedback, and then there's this other element, and this is a phrase. I've heard this phrase.
Okay.
Doe maar gewoon, dan doe je al gek genoeg.
Nailed it.
Okay, good.
Perfect pronunciation.
What does that mean, and how does that fit into all of this?
So that lovely phrase literally translates to act normal, that's crazy enough,
I love that.
which I think kind of really gets to the heart of another really key aspect of Dutch culture, which is this sense of egalitarianism and modesty.
Okay.
So, not only are you good geregeld, you're organized, you're efficient, but you don't necessarily brag about it.
You don't boast.
You don't boast about it, exactly.
You're not like, look at how organized I am.
Exactly. And, and I think you have to remember, this is a country that was literally built on consensus. It was built on cooperation.
Yeah.
So this idea that somebody would come in and kind of, toot their own horn too much or act like they're better than anyone else, it goes against the grain of their cultural values.
So it's almost like the opposite of the American go-getter, climb the ladder mentality.
It's definitely a different approach.
Yeah.
And I think it influences everything from the way they interact with their colleagues to how they raise their kids. It's not so much about individual achievement. It's more about kind of focusing on the collective good,
It makes you wonder how people adjust to that. Like, if you're coming from a culture where it is all about
Absolutely.
the individual and their accomplishments.
That's the beauty of cultural exchange, isn't it? It's like it challenges our assumptions and it makes us kind of see the world through a different lens.
Totally.
And sometimes it even makes us question our own, really deeply held beliefs about the world.
So true. But speaking of cultural differences,
Okay.
there was one thing in Saskia's article that really, I don't know, kind of threw me for a loop. And she talks about this contradiction about Dutch hospitality.
Yes, the Dutch paradox.
Yeah.
They can seem incredibly friendly and a little bit distant, I guess, at the same time.
Yeah, because you hear people say, oh, the Dutch are so friendly, but then you hear about this agenda culture and you're like, wait, I need a calendar appointment to have coffee with someone?
Right. Yeah, it's not quite that extreme.
Okay.
But there is this real emphasis on planning and respecting personal time.
Yeah.
And I think, again, this goes back to that good geregeld mentality.
Right.
It extends to their social lives as well.
So it's not that they don't want to see you.
Right.
It's just, they might need a little bit of a heads up.
Yeah, spontaneity is maybe not their strongest suit.
Right.
You think about it, the Dutch, they really value their time and they see it as a precious resource.
Yeah.
It's not something to be wasted, so they plan their days, their weeks, even their social lives very, very meticulously.
And, like a random drop-in.
Right.
Just throws the whole system off.
It can throw a wrench in things.
Yeah.
And, again, it's not that they're not going to welcome you with open arms, but, you might not get that same kind of enthusiastic welcome that you might get in a culture that's a little bit more, accustomed to that kind of spontaneity.
Saskia tells this really funny anecdote in the article about, how in some cultures, like, if you show up at someone's house unannounced, it's like, out comes the feast,
Yeah, right.
Like, welcome, welcome. And it's like, all of a sudden there's food and drinks and...
And in the Netherlands, you're more likely to get, oh, you should have called. I haven't tidied up.
Exactly. Exactly. Like, give me a minute to get ready.
Yes, exactly.
To host you properly.
Yeah, let me get my act together, right?
Okay, so I think the takeaway there is just be mindful of their time.
Be mindful of their time.
Communicate your plans.
Absolutely.
No last minute drop-ins.
Exactly. And I think this also kind of ties back into that individualistic nature that we talked about earlier. Just as they value their own personal space and their own time,
Yeah.
they also place a really high value on independence, on self-reliance.
Which, as we talked about before, is very different from some of those more collectivist cultures where it's a lot more about family ties, those obligations to other people.
Exactly.
So the Dutch, family's still important.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But there is this kind of understanding that children are encouraged to be independent from a young age, and people's personal goals and aspirations are very highly valued.
It is really fascinating how all these little pieces that we're talking about
Yep.
all tie together. Like it's it's the history, it's the geography, it's this good Garrigild, this direct communication.
It all paints this really fascinating picture
It really does. It really does.
of what makes this culture unique.
Yeah.
And it just, it reminds us that understanding a culture isn't just about memorizing a list of do's and don'ts.
Right.
It's about, digging a little bit deeper, appreciating the nuances, embracing the things that make each culture special, even if it's a little bit different from what we're used to.
It's of the why.
Even
about
Hawaii
like
yeah.
why do they do things this way?
Absolutely.
So for anyone listening who maybe is thinking about a trip to the Netherlands or maybe even like a more permanent move, what would your advice to them be?
I think my biggest piece of advice would be, go in with an open mind and a willingness to embrace the experience, even if it's a little bit different from what you're used to.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to ask questions, to observe the locals, and even to laugh along at those little cultural quirks that maybe make you scratch your head a little bit.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. That's great advice. And hey, if you are offered one of those, perfectly arranged cheese platters when you're there, maybe just give them a little bit of a heads up before you pop over for a second visit.
Schedule that follow-up.
Just to be safe. This was really interesting. I learned a lot. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to all of our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep learning, and we will see you next time for another deep dive.